At the family dinner, they pushed me to a plastic chair at the corner, while everyone else dined at the long oak table laughing about their first-class tickets to Hawaii. My mother smirked and said I didn't belong because I had nothing to offer, and my brother promised to send me a postcard just to rub it in. I clenched my jaw and told myself one day the tables would turn, and when I finally held that $2 million ticket, I knew the moment had come. The good dishes were already set when I walked into my parents' dining room in Portland on white porcelain plates with a thin silver band polished forks that caught the light and wine glasses lined up like a chorus. My mother had placed a small square table by the window where the draft sneaks in each winter. On it sat a plastic plate, a paper napkin folded into an almost perfect triangle, and a cup that used to come free with a takeout meal. I stood there with my coat still on, hearing my name float from the kitchen in my mother's clipped voice, and I knew the seat by the window was mine. I shrugged out of my coat and hung it on the back of a chair that did not belong to my table. My sister Hannah had already settled at the main table, hair sleek and straight, the way her marketing firm prefers on client nights, tapping something on her phone with a smile that said she belonged exactly where she was. Paul, her husband, took up space beside her in a soft blue sweater, telling my father about an investment property in Lake Oswego, like he owned the block. My brother Daniel had that relaxed posture I associate with well-paid dentists who only run late when the anesthetic takes longer than expected. He was passing rolls to his wife and laughing at something my father had said, the sound filling the room with a warmth that did not reach the corner where my table waited. My mother reappeared with a roasting pan and said she had put me at the little table so I would be more comfortable. Then she added that I never really contribute much when we host, so it made sense. She said it in the same tone she uses when reminding my father to turn off the porch light, practical tidying a decision already made. The words landed like a thin layer of ice over water, not thick enough to hold weight, cold enough to sting. I nodded and took my seat. The chair wobbled because one felt pad was missing, so each time I shifted the leg clicked against the hardwood. From the far end of the main table, my father lifted his glass and said they were thrilled about the Hawaii trip next month, that the resort had confirmed their ocean view suites, and Daniel had found a great deal on first class because of some loyalty program. He looked at me while he spoke, and finished with a line about there being no space for people who cannot keep up, said in the way he presents a business decision that is already signed and filed. The room laughed, because laughter is easier than the silence that would come if anyone questioned him. I touched the rim of my plastic plate and held my face still. Hannah asked if anyone had seen the photos of the infinity pool at the resort, and said she could not wait to order a pineapple drink served in an actual pineapple. Then she leaned back and studied me like I was the person who had asked for pineapple money. Daniel announced he had arranged a snorkeling excursion and teased that he would mail me a postcard so I would not feel left out. He said it lightly, but he wanted the words to stick. Paul asked my father about golf courses near the resort and suggested they bring their own clubs, rather than renting, a question that made my mother glow because it meant planning and packing and lists she could check off with satisfaction. I reached for water and discovered my cup had a faint line of old coffee at the bottom that no one had bothered to scrub out. I tipped it toward the sink in the kitchen doorway and caught my mother's glance. She said something about how things had been hectic and that I should be grateful a setting had been placed for me at all. I told her I was fine, and my voice sounded steady enough that I almost believed it. The smells in the room were familiar. Rosemary and garlic from the potatoes, lemon from the dressing. A vanilla candle my mother always lights when company comes. A game hummed from the living room, where the television washed the hallway in blue, the sound of a crowd swelling and ebbing like a tide. Outside, a light rain started tapping the glass behind my chair. For a second, I saw a reflection of my own face, the small table framing me like a picture that does not belong with the rest of the gallery. When we bowed our heads, my father thanked God for family and provision, and opportunities earned through hard work. He asked that we be reminded of our responsibilities, and that those among us who had lost our way find the path back to purpose. I kept my eyes closed and counted my breaths, and imagined something small and warm cupped in my hands, something only I could see. Dinner moved the way dinners move when everyone knows their cues. Compliments to the cook, updates on a remodel, A short story about a coworker who overshares my mother's anecdote about the woman in line at the grocery store who had too many coupons and held everyone hostage. There were 5 conversations happening at once at the main table, overlapping friendly practice. At my table, I cut the chicken into small pieces and ate slowly so it would look like a choice. Hannah leaned toward me just enough to be heard and asked if I had finally decided what to do about my work schedule at the freight company. She reminded me that part-time is not a career and suggested that I consider going back to school for something marketable, something where she might know someone who could help if I made a strong first impression. I told her I appreciated the advice and that I would think about it. Daniel asked whether I had managed to keep up with my student loan payments, and then assured me there are programs that help people in difficult circumstances, as if I were a flyer he had picked up at his clinic and decided to hand to me on his way out. My mother stood and carried the salad bowl away. She returned without looking at me and slid the cheesecake in front of my father so he could portion it with the knife he loves because it is balanced. He handed out slices around the main table and told a joke about a golfer who lies about his handicap. I waited with my fork on the paper napkin in case someone remembered my corner. After a while, my mother realized there was still a piece on the platter and placed it on my plastic plate without eye contact. The tip of the piece had smeared across the rim. I used the edge of my fork to pull it back toward the center and found the patience to lift it in small bites. Paul asked my father if he planned to rent a convertible on the island, and my father said he had already booked a red one because life is short and you should always choose the fun option when you can afford it. He said this while looking at me again and held my gaze longer than usual, not angry, something worse, that bland assurance that his choices were lessons I should learn from. I pressed my tongue to the inside of my cheek until the taste of sugar went metallic. When the plates were cleared, my mother announced that she had ordered matching shirts for the trip and held them up one by one, palm trees and a subtle logo from the resort. Hannah clapped and Daniel whistled, and my father said, "This is the kind of thing that makes memories." My name was not called. The shirts were counted and folded and tucked into a bag, already half packed. On the wall behind my parents, a framed photo from a summer at Cannon Beach showed Hannah on my father's shoulders, Daniel mid-jump near the water, me cropped at the elbow, because the wind had turned my hair across my face, and my mother had decided it spoiled the composition. I felt Charlotte's text buzz through my phone, where it rested on my thigh. She asked if I was hanging in. I typed back that I was fine and would call later. I did not want to send anything that could light up my screen with pity. My mother started stacking the side plates and said she hoped everyone understood that hosting a family takes work and contributions, and that some of us were not in a position to shoulder that. She used the phrase, "not in a position," the way my father uses the phrase, "not a good fit," during his old performance reviews. Daniel said, "Travel is for people who plan and prioritize," and then he added that some of us never learned how to do either. I watched my father bring the bottle to the table and refill glasses, a slick, practiced motion. Then he set it by his elbow and leaned back like a man satisfied with the shape of his life. I slid my chair back from the window, and the leg clicked against the floor again. My mother winced at the sound the way she winces when a knife touches the wrong cutting board. She asked me to be careful with the finish on the hardwood. I said I would. Then I tucked the chair back under my little table and carried my plate to the sink because I needed to move. In the kitchen, the light was brighter, the counters clean except for the roasting pan cooling on a trivet. I rinsed my plate and the plastic bent under the water's heat and went soft in my hand. My mother joined me and said she hoped I did not take the seating personally. She said the main table was full and that next time I should let her know earlier if I planned to come so she could plan properly. I told her I had confirmed 2 days ago, and she said the week had been a blur. She reminded me that Hawaii was a big expense and that it would not be fair to ask the others to cover me. I nodded and said I never asked. She smiled like we had agreed on something reasonable. When I stepped back into the dining room, the television crowd in the living room erupted something about a last-second shot, and the men at the main table cheered without standing. The rain had thickened outside, beating on the glass, and for a second, the whole room looked like it was underwater. I picked up my coat from the back of the wrong chair and slipped it on. My father asked if I was heading out already. I said I had an early morning, which was true, and he reminded me that life is easier when you keep a schedule and stay focused. Hannah blew me a small kiss without meeting my eyes and said we would catch up soon. Daniel told me not to be a stranger. Paul asked me to send along the contact for a freight discount he thought my company might have, then waved it off when I said I would have to ask. I walked to the front door and paused long enough to take in the hallway mirror. The coat fit well, because I had saved for it, and waited for a sale, the kind of planning my brother would call basic. My face looked composed in that way it sometimes does when the inside is loud. I could still hear laughter from the dining room as I opened the door, and the rainy air rushed in cool and clean. I stepped onto the porch and pulled the door behind me until the latch caught. Then I stood there for a breath and let the sound of the street replace the noise of the house. The rain misted across the porch light as I walked to my car, the sound of my shoes clicking against the wet pavement, louder than the voices still spilling out of the house behind me. By the time I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, my hands were gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to, my chest heavy with a silence that tasted like iron. I told myself to breathe, to focus on the red glow of the traffic light, but the echo of their laughter stayed with me. 2 nights later, I found myself back at my parents' house for Sunday dinner, as if nothing had shifted, as if the small table in the corner had not branded itself into my memory. The dining room smelled of roasted lamb this time, rosemary and butter rolling thick in the air. The main table was already set with linen napkins folded into fans, and the good stemware polished to a shine. I slipped into my chair at the edge, trying not to think about whether they would move me again. My mother was arranging place cards as if we were hosting senators. She placed one with my name at the very end, still part of the main table, but just barely, like she was being generous. The talk began before the plates landed. Hannah's voice lifted above the clatter as she scrolled on her phone describing the resort in Maui, where they had booked a block of suites. She turned the screen to show off glossy photos of infinity pools that bled into turquoise water. Paul leaned close to admire the swim-up bar. My father nodded with approval, already picturing himself with a cigar and a drink in the shallow end. Daniel said he had managed to upgrade their flights to first class, using his dental conference miles. He patted himself on the back while his wife kissed his cheek. My mother clapped her hands like a child at Christmas and said it would be the trip of a lifetime. I cleared my throat and asked softly if I was part of the plan. The words barely carried, but they landed because everyone went quiet for half a beat. My mother's eyes sharpened, her lips pressing into that firm line she uses when a waiter forgets her order. She told me it was not realistic for me to join, that costs had to be shared, and I was in no position to carry my part. She added that it would spoil the excitement if I insisted on tagging along. The room relaxed again as she spoke, as if she had straightened a wrinkle in the tablecloth. Hannah gave a small laugh and said, "No one goes to Hawaii with someone who still works a patchy schedule at a freight office." Her words were sugar-sweet, coated with a smirk. She reached across to tap Paul's arm and asked him if he could imagine me trying to fit into the resort lobby with my thrift store bag. Paul chuckled and looked down, not disagreeing. I felt the weight of their eyes and kept my hands folded on my lap. Daniel leaned back in his chair, grinning. He said he would make sure to send me a postcard so I would not feel too left out. He made a show of miming the act of writing, saying maybe he would find one with a cartoon hula girl on it just for me. The others laughed, even my father, who usually stayed neutral. My mother tilted her head and let out that careful laugh she saves for the country club. It stung sharper than any of their words because it meant she approved of the joke. I tried to eat, but the lamb stuck in my throat. My fork scraped the plate louder than I intended. I focused on chewing and swallowing, on keeping my face steady. Inside, I felt something shift, not a sharp break, but the slow heat of coal catching fire. I told myself to remember every word, every look, to store it, the way you store a debt that will one day come due. The dinner carried on with details about snorkeling excursions, golf tee times, and luau's under the stars. My mother said she had already ordered matching polos embroidered with the resort logo. Hannah offered to bring her professional camera so they could take a family photo for the Christmas card. She did not say my name when she listed who would be in the shot. My father described the convertible he wanted to rent red with leather seats, and Daniel joked about how it would be wasted on someone who never learned to drive stick. They all laughed again, the sound smooth and practiced. I sat there tasting the bitterness under the rosemary, the sound of my chair a beat behind theirs, my glass never quite clinking in rhythm with theirs. I thought about how small they wanted me to be, how carefully they placed me at the margins of their table and their lives. And then, under the noise of their plans, I heard my own thought rising clear. One day, this will be different. One day I will not be the shadow at the edge of their picture. The words sat steady in my chest, heavier than the food, stronger than the laughter around me. I did not smile, not even when my father raised his glass again. I simply lifted mine enough to catch the light and let the fire inside burn. The following evening, I sat across from Charlotte at a small diner near the hospital where she worked. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the smell of coffee and fried onions clung to the air. She wore her scrubs, her hair pulled back in a bun that had loosened through a 12-hour shift, yet her eyes were sharp when she leaned forward and asked me how dinner had gone. I stirred the sugar in my mug long after it dissolved and told her about the little table, about the resort brochures waved in my face, about the postcard joke that had drawn so much laughter. My voice was flat, but my hands betrayed me, shaking just enough to make the spoon clink against the ceramic. Charlotte listened the way she always did, without interrupting, her silence steady as a held hand. When I finally let the words run dry, she reached over and covered my wrist with her palm. She told me I was worth more than they would ever admit, that I had more grit than Hannah, with her polished heels, more honesty than Daniel with his perfect smile, more soul than all of them combined. She said families sometimes build their own prisons and lock you in the smallest cell, but that did not make you any less powerful. I felt my throat tighten, and I forced the coffee down before it could rise again. Her words sent me back to other nights, when the cell had felt even smaller. One Christmas, the tree glowed with ornaments my mother had collected from her travels, delicate glass spheres and hand-painted stars. Boxes stacked high filled the room with the promise of abundance. Hannah tore open a velvet case that revealed diamond earrings Daniel had given her, the kind that sparkled under the lights with the sharpness of ice. My father lifted his glass to toast Daniel's generosity. When my turn came, a paper bag slid across the floor toward me, inside a set of gloves from the clearance rack, the tag still dangling with a red slash through the price. My mother said they were practical, and I smiled because there was nothing else to do. On my birthday the following spring, the house had been full of voices, yet no one remembered. I baked my own cupcake later that night in my apartment, the single candle flickering against the quiet. My phone buzzed once with a text from Charlotte, who had remembered without being told. Daniel, meanwhile, had stopped by my parents' place that afternoon to hand Hannah a leather handbag he had flown in from Milan, a gift for no occasion other than her being his sister, who mattered. I had been there to see it standing in the kitchen doorway, as Hannah squealed and twirled the bag swinging from her arm. Daniel kissed her forehead and said she deserved nice things. He never looked my way. I pulled myself back to the diner table, where Charlotte was watching me with the same patience she had when comforting patients in pain. I told her that sometimes I felt like my whole life was staged for their amusement, like my failures were the entertainment they served with dinner. Charlotte shook her head and said I was more than their sideshow. She told me to hold on to that anger, to use it like fuel, instead of letting it eat me alive. Her voice softened then, and she reminded me that people like my family only value what they can measure in money and status. She said the world is wider than their narrow dining room, and one day I would prove it to them. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment, the bathroom light humming overhead. My reflection stared back, the lines around my eyes deeper than I remembered, my hair pulled into a careless knot. I leaned closer, close enough to fog the glass with my breath, and I whispered words I had never dared say aloud before. This would be the last time they made me feel small. This would be the last time I let them laugh while I swallowed the hurt. My voice was quiet, almost fragile, but it carried in the tiny space. I pressed my fingertips to the cool surface of the mirror, as if sealing a pact with the woman staring back. The room stayed still, the air heavy with the scent of lavender soap, and for the first time in years, I did not look away from myself. 2 weeks later, my manager at Cascade Freight called me into his office with a stack of papers on his desk. He told me I had been selected to attend a transportation conference in Las Vegas, all expenses covered except for meals. It was meant to be an opportunity for networking, though I suspected he had chosen me because no one else wanted to trade a week of their life for panel discussions on freight logistics. I nodded and thanked him as if it were an honor. Inside, I felt a flicker of something lighter, the thought of leaving Portland behind for a few days, stepping outside the circle my family kept me locked inside. The plane touched down under a hot Nevada sun, the air dry and full of dust. The cab from McCarran Airport carried me past neon billboards and sprawling resorts that looked like they had been carved out of fantasy. The hotel for the conference was nothing spectacular, just another mid-range tower with beige carpets and the faint smell of cigarettes clinging to the hallways. But it was different from my apartment, and that was enough. During the day, I sat through sessions on fleet safety data tracking and fuel efficiency, nodding at strangers in suits who talked more about golf than shipping containers. At night, I found myself restless, the city outside, humming like an engine that never cut off. On the third night, I walked down Fremont Street, the old part of Vegas, where the ceiling of lights turned the night into a carnival. Street performers juggled fire, while cover bands blasted 70s rock, the air thick with the smell of grilled meat and cheap perfume. Tourists in shorts stumbled past with plastic cups of beer, and couples posed in front of glowing slot machines. I felt both invisible and alive moving through the crowd, with no one to judge me, no one to tell me where I did or did not belong. A small kiosk caught my eye between a souvenir shop and a taco stand. Bright posters promised dreams for just a few dollars, the Powerball logo flashing under a string of light bulbs. The clerk, a heavy man in a baseball cap, leaned on the counter flipping through a magazine. I slowed my steps, telling myself it was foolish that people like me did not win. Still, my feet carried me forward. My wallet was thin, holding the last $20 bill I had set aside for the week. My stomach twisted at the thought of handing it over, but my fingers moved anyway, sliding the note across the counter. The clerk tore off a strip of tickets and pushed them toward me without looking up. The paper felt fragile in my hand, like it could vanish with one wrong breath. I tucked it quickly into my purse, pressing the clasp shut, as if sealing away a secret. My heart raced in a rhythm too fast for the calm night air. I walked on, trying to focus on the flashing signs and the smell of roasted peanuts, but all I felt was the weight of those tickets against the fabric of my bag. It was a gamble, a small one, yet it felt like I had just placed my entire life on the table. I found a bench near a fountain and sat for a while watching the streams of water rise and fall, in time with music I barely heard. Around me, laughter and chatter swelled, but my thoughts circled tightly around the folded slips of paper. It was absurd to imagine they could change anything, yet I could not shake the heat pulsing in my chest. For years I had been the one overlooked, the one left at the end of the table, the one handed gloves from a discount bin, while others opened boxes of diamonds. Maybe those tickets would end up as nothing more than paper scraps in the trash. But for the first time in a long time, I felt as if I had taken a step towards something that belonged only to me. The fountain lights shifted from blue to red, casting the water in a glow that looked almost like fire. I stood and walked back toward my hotel, clutching my purse close against my side. The streets were still alive with sound, but everything seemed distant. Each step was heavier, not from the desert heat, but from the knowledge that in my bag lay a chance, however slim, that life might tilt in my favor. When I reached the elevator and saw my reflection in the mirrored walls, my eyes looked sharper, my jaw set firmer. I held the purse tighter and whispered under my breath that maybe fate was finally listening. Then the doors slid open, and I stepped inside with the sound of my heartbeat louder than the music still drifting from Fremont Street. The 4th of July came heavy with heat, the kind that made the air above the pavement shimmer. I sat in my small living room with the blinds half drawn, a bowl of popcorn cooling untouched on the coffee table. The television blared with the familiar pageantry parades marching across the screen in bursts of color, anchors smiling too wide as they counted down to the fireworks. I had come home from Vegas days earlier, the tickets folded tight in my wallet, like a secret I was afraid to unfold. I had told myself not to hope, not to dream that it was only paper. Yet I sat there that evening with the remote in one hand and the strip of tickets in the other, my thumb rubbing against the numbers until the ink smudged faintly. The announcer's voice rose as the first balls rolled into view. White spheres spun under the bright studio lights, bouncing until one dropped into the slot. 32. My eyes shot to the ticket. 32 glared back at me. I whispered the number aloud, as if the sound could make it real. Another ball fell. 17. It was there, too clear and certain on the line of numbers. My chest tightened and my fingers clutched the ticket harder. The next came, then the next, each one striking me like a hammer. Every number matched. My vision blurred, the television glowing through a wash of tears. When the final red Powerball rolled into place, and I saw the last number align, I felt the floor tilt beneath me. $2 million. The announcer said it like it was a dream, a prize beyond imagining. I pressed the ticket to my lips, my breath catching in ragged bursts. My heart slammed so violently I thought it might stop. Tears ran down my face, unchecked, hot, and unrelenting, as if years of humiliation and small cruelties had poured themselves into this moment. I staggered to my feet and paced the room, the popcorn scattering as my knee brushed the table. I wanted to scream, to laugh, to run outside and tell the world, but I held it all inside like a secret flame. My family's faces rose in my mind, their laughter around the dinner table, their cold eyes when they dismissed me. I clutched the ticket tighter and swore they would not hear of this from my lips. Not yet. My fingers shook as I dialed Charlotte. When her voice answered warm and steady, the words tumbled out of me in broken gasps. I told her the numbers had matched, that it was real, that I was holding the proof in my hands. For a moment she said nothing. Then she let out a sharp cry that turned into a laugh. She told me this was the universe writing itself, that I deserved it more than anyone she knew. Her excitement wrapped around me like a blanket, but beneath it she spoke firmly. Do not tell your family. Not a word. Not yet. Her warning struck me sober. I promised her I would stay silent. The next morning, I searched for answers, my laptop balanced on my knees, as I typed until my fingers cramped. Every article I read warned of the dangers of sudden wealth, the vultures it attracted, the families torn apart. Buried in one thread of advice was the same name repeated, a Portland attorney who specialized in asset protection. By afternoon, I stood outside his office, the July sun baking the brick walls. Greg Thompson looked younger than his reputation suggested, his hair peppered gray, but his eyes sharp behind square glasses. He invited me into a leather chair across from his desk and asked to see the ticket. My hands trembled as I laid it down like a sacred offering. He examined it briefly, then leaned back with a nod. Congratulations, he said, and I flinched at the word, as though it might echo down the hall. His voice softened as he explained what came next. The most important step, he said, was to create a trust. Put the winnings into a structure that bore a name not mine, so when the check arrived, no one could connect it directly to me. He told me secrecy was my shield. Do not tell your family, do not post on social media, and do not even hint at the windfall. People would come for it. People I knew, and people I did not. His words landed heavy, but his tone was steady, like a surgeon laying out the procedure. I nodded, swallowing against the dryness in my throat. He asked what I wanted the trust to be called. For a moment, my mind went blank. Then one word rose unbidden. Horizon. A horizon was where the sun rose anew each day, a place just out of reach, but filled with promise. Greg wrote it down, and with each stroke of his pen, I felt the weight of years of smallness begin to lift. He explained the paperwork, the timelines, the taxes. It all blurred, but I clung to the instructions he repeated. Silence, trust, protection. When I left his office, the city seemed different, sharper at the edges. The sound of traffic roared louder, the scent of food from a nearby cart, richer. I walked with the ticket pressed flat inside an envelope, now sealed and heavy in my purse. Fireworks cracked faintly in the distance, as the evening sky darkened bursts of color reflecting off glass windows. I paused on the corner, tilting my head back to watch the explosions bloom overhead. The crowd cheered, children waved sparklers, and for once I let the noise wash through me without shrinking from it. My lips curved into a smile that no one saw. Hidden in my bag, the future beat in time with my heart. The following week, I met Greg again in his office, the blinds drawn tight against the summer sun. He slid a folder across the polished desk and spoke in the same steady tone as before, each word crisp. The Horizon Trust had been established, the winnings would be deposited quietly, and I would not need to stand before cameras or claim a giant check. He guided me through forms for a new bank account under the trust's name, and when I signed the lines, my hand felt both weightless and heavy. He explained the next steps, introducing me to a discreet financial advisor. He trusted a woman named Linda Parker, who specialized in clients who wanted to remain invisible. Linda met me 2 days later at a cafe near the riverfront. She wore a navy dress and carried a leather folio, her voice low but kind. She asked about my goals, my fears, what I wanted this money to mean. For the first time, I said the words aloud, that I did not want to depend on anyone again, that I wanted to build a life beyond the reach of family who saw me only as less. Linda nodded and outlined a plan. Diversify into bonds, real estate, low-risk funds, she said. Think long-term. She promised to handle the details while I kept my head down. I left the cafe with her card tucked safely in my purse, a strange calm settling into me like a new skin. At home, my phone buzzed with a steady stream of notifications. Photos lit up the family group chat. Daniel on a white sand beach in Hawaii, his arms slung around his wife and their 2 kids, who grinned with ice cream dripping down their chins. Hannah stretched on a lounge chair in a designer swimsuit, the infinity pool spilling into the horizon behind her. My mother posed with a cocktail, her nails painted coral, her eyes shaded with sunglasses that probably cost more than my rent. The captions were full of exclamation points and sun emojis, as if joy itself had been bottled on that island. I stared at each image without flinching. Then Daniel's private message arrived. The photo showed him and his wife beneath a palm tree, their smiles smug and perfect. The words beneath it cut sharper than the picture. Nobody here even remembers you. My chest rose once in a long breath, but no ache followed. Instead, a small smile tugged at the corner of my lips. I typed nothing back, set the phone down, and let the silence speak for me. For the first time, their cruelty did not pierce. It brushed against me like wind against stone, unable to find a crack. Days passed, and the rhythm of my life shifted quietly. I still went to work each morning, clocking in at Cascade Freight, answering emails about delivery schedules and fuel reports. My coworkers grumbled about traffic and late shipments, and I nodded in time, hiding the truth under plain blouses and careful words. In the evenings, I met with Linda again. Her advice meticulous, her spreadsheets dense with numbers that no longer frightened me. She explained compounding growth tax shelters, charitable trusts. I listened with the hunger of someone tasting freedom for the first time. Each dollar was not just money, it was proof that I had carved something out for myself in secret. One evening, after a long day, I poured a glass of water and sat by the window watching the sunset paint the Willamette River in streaks of orange and gold. My phone buzzed again with more photos from Hawaii. Hannah leaning against a tiki bar, Daniel splashing in the surf, my parents draped in leis. Another message came through from Daniel. "Hope you are enjoying Portland," he wrote, followed by a laughing face. I read it twice, then set the phone face down on the table. My lips curved upward, but it was not the smile of hurt. It was the smile of someone who carried knowledge no one else in the picture could imagine. As the light faded and the first stars appeared, I leaned back and closed my eyes. Their laughter echoed faintly in memory, but underneath it, another sound pulsed steady. The sound of a new future taking shape, guarded and quiet, hidden from those who would only seek to drain it. My family thought I was still the one left at the small table, eating from plastic plates unwanted on the beach, forgotten in their games. What they did not know was that the balance had already begun to shift. I opened my eyes and whispered into the still room that if they knew the truth, everything would turn upside down. The following weekend, I drove across town to the modest neighborhood where my Aunt Linda lived. Her small house sat on a narrow street lined with maples, the paint on the siding peeling in places, but the garden in front blooming with careful rows of daisies. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, before stepping out into the quiet afternoon. The screen door creaked as she opened it, and her face broke into a smile that reached her eyes. She hugged me tight, smelling faintly of flower and lavender lotion, and ushered me inside. Her living room was warm, cluttered with books stacked in uneven towers, and framed photographs of former students on the walls. She had been teaching high school English for decades, never married, always pouring herself into her classroom, and the handful of nieces and nephews she cared for in her own way. We sat at her kitchen table, chipped at the corners with 2 mugs of tea between us. She asked about work, and I told her the usual pieces, careful not to let anything slip. She watched me quietly, as if sensing a shift beneath my words. After a pause, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "If you ever need help, Emily," she said softly, "I want you to know I have a little set aside. It is not much, but you would not have to face things alone." My throat tightened at her words. I looked at her hands, the lines etched deep from years of grading papers late into the night, and I felt something break inside me. No one else had offered me anything but disdain, and here was a woman with barely enough for herself, ready to give without asking. I managed a smile, blinking back tears. "Thank you," I whispered. She squeezed my hand and let go, then turned the conversation to lighter things, telling me about a student who had brought a stray dog to class and about her plan to bake a peach cobbler the next day. I listened, but my mind raced. As I glanced around her kitchen, I noticed the unopened envelopes stacked neatly on a shelf. The red ink of overdue notices peeked from the corners. She had tried to hide them, but I recognized the weight of debt immediately. That night, I sat at my own kitchen table with the laptop open, the glow casting long shadows across the walls. I entered the information I remembered from the envelopes, searching until the screen filled with the truth. She was behind on her mortgage, the bank pressing closer each month. My heart clenched. With all that she had done for others, with the life of quiet sacrifice she had led, she deserved more than nights spent worrying over foreclosure letters. My decision came swiftly, without hesitation. I reached out to Linda Parker, my advisor, and asked her to arrange a payment. Not from me, not directly, but from an anonymous donor. Enough to wipe the debt clean. The following week, my aunt called me unexpectedly. Her voice trembled through the receiver. "Emily, you will not believe this. The bank called today. They said my mortgage was settled, completely." She stammered in disbelief, her words tumbling over one another. She had no idea who could have done it. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, swallowing hard to keep my voice steady. "That is incredible," I said, feigning surprise. "Maybe someone who knows how much you give to others wanted to give something back." She laughed shakily, tears audible in the break of her voice, and I felt my own eyes blur. After we hung up, I sat very still in my living room. The silence wrapped around me, but it was not empty. For once, the weight in my chest was not pain, but a deep warmth. I realized with piercing clarity that this was what love looked like, not the flashy vacations or the expensive dinners that my family flaunted, but the quiet readiness to give when you had almost nothing. My aunt had stood by me in ways my own parents never had, and now I had given something back to her, even if she would never know it came from me. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. The faces of my mother, my father, my siblings flickered in memory, their laughter sharp, their words cutting. Then I thought of Linda's small smile, her kitchen cluttered with books, her hand warm on mine, as she told me she would share what little she had. The contrast struck me like a bell ringing clear. It was not wealth that proved loyalty, it was sacrifice. And in that moment, I knew with certainty who truly stood by me. The night stretched long, but sleep came easier than it had in years. The call came from my mother 2 days after they returned. Her tone was brisk, almost rehearsed, as she said there would be a family dinner that Sunday and I should come by. For appearances, she added quickly, as if inviting me were a box she had to check rather than a desire. I hung up slowly, staring at the phone in my hand, then nodded to myself. I would go. Not because I wanted to hear their stories, but because I no longer feared their words. That Sunday, I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house. The familiar blue shutters faded, but the flower beds carefully trimmed. Laughter spilled from the open windows. When I stepped inside, the smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the air. My siblings were already gathered around the long oak table, drinks in hand, their faces still glowing with tan lines from the Hawaiian sun. I walked into the room, and the chatter dipped slightly, as if the temperature had shifted by a degree. Hannah's eyes found me first. She tilted her glass of white wine, her lips curling in amusement. While we were sipping cocktails under palm trees, "I bet you were curled up here in Portland with reruns on TV," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. A few chuckles rippled around the table. I held her gaze for a beat, then offered a faint smile without answering. Something in my silence unsettled her because she looked away first. Daniel's son Ryan, only 22, bounced in his chair with the restless energy of someone who had just discovered the edge of adulthood. "Guess what, Aunt Emily," he said, his voice booming. "Dad helped me get a brand new Mustang, 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds. He slapped the keys on the table proudly. All on his credit card. My dad says I can pay him back when I get a real job, but who cares, right?" The table erupted in laughter again, Daniel raising his glass to toast his son. I watched them all, their smiles wide, their joy loud, and I felt as if I were on the other side of a glass wall. My mother turned to me, her fork poised over her plate. "You see how well everyone is doing?" she said, her words dripping with satisfaction. I nodded politely, reaching for my water, and let the remark pass. My father added that the resort had been magnificent, 5 stars worth every penny. Hannah described the poolside service in detail, and Daniel chimed in about the golf course overlooking the ocean. Each story was like a jewel they passed around, admiring from every angle. They wanted me to see what I had missed, to feel small in their glow. But I did not shrink. I sat still, steady, letting their words float past like leaves on a current. As the evening wore on, their laughter grew louder, their stories more exaggerated. Ryan pulled out his phone to show a video of himself revving the Mustang's engine, the sound filling the dining room. Daniel beamed at him, pride clear in his eyes. I sipped my water and set the glass down carefully, my expression calm. For the first time in my life, I did not feel envy pressing into my chest. I felt a quiet strength instead, like a fire banked low but steady. My mother finally noticed. She leaned forward slightly, studying me as if something about me had shifted. "You are very quiet tonight," she said. I met her eyes and smiled faintly again, my silence deliberate. Around me the table buzzed with noise, but inside me was stillness. They had no idea of the truth I carried of the future, already reshaped in secret. Their barbs glanced off without leaving marks. For once, I was the one watching them perform, and it was they who seemed slightly unsettled by the lack of reaction. When dessert was brought out and the plates clattered, I rose to help clear the table. My mother waved me off, almost surprised. "Sit," she said, "we have it." I sank back into my chair, folding my hands together, and observed the room. The gleam of pride in Daniel's eyes, the smug curve of Hannah's smile, the oblivious chatter of my father, the practiced superiority of my mother. All of them shining in their own reflection, never noticing how the mirror had shifted. I smiled again quietly and let the noise wash over me. When the laughter settled and coffee cups were refilled, I cleared my throat softly and let my eyes drift around the table. Everyone was still talking over one another, flushed from wine and their own stories. I waited until the pause came naturally, then spoke. "I heard you are all planning something for Christmas," I said evenly, and I was wondering if I might join. The words were simple, but they pulled the air tight. My mother's fork stilled midair, her lips pressing into a thin line. She set it down carefully, as if even the clink might betray more than she wished. "We already talked about that, Emily," she said. "We are trying to keep costs balanced. Hawaii was expensive, and adding another person is not practical." Her voice was calm, but final, clipped at the edges like paper cut clean. Before I could respond, Paul leaned back in his chair, his arms slung across Hannah's. His smile was polite, but sharp. "You should probably think about where you fit, Emily," he said. "Family trips like these come with a certain level of responsibility. Not everyone is in a position to contribute." His eyes slid past me as if I were air. Hannah giggled lightly, resting her head on his shoulder, as if his words had been a charming joke. I let my hands rest on the table, palms flat, and lowered my eyes. "I understand," I murmured, letting just enough weight into my voice to sound worn. "Things have been hard lately. Bills piling up. I was hoping Christmas might feel a little different this year." I glanced around the table, watching. There it was. The test. Who among them would meet my eyes with something other than disdain? Silence stretched, broken only by the scrape of Daniel's knife on his plate as he cut another piece of chicken. He did not look at me. Hannah shifted uncomfortably, then lifted her glass and said she needed a refill. Ryan was already scrolling his phone, attention gone. My father coughed and muttered about the stock market, steering the subject away. No hand reached across the table. No voice offered comfort. No one said, "We will figure it out together." I nodded slowly, swallowing the lump that rose in my throat. I forced a small smile, as if to cover the slip, then leaned back and let the conversation carry on without me. They launched into new stories about Hawaii, about the cocktails at the pool bar, about Daniel's round of golf where he claimed to have nearly hit par. I listened silent, my fingers curling in my lap. The sting was there, yes, but sharper than that was the clarity. None of them would stand by me, not one, except for the woman who never sat at this table. Later that night, I drove across town to Aunt Linda's. Her porch light was still on, and when she opened the door, she looked surprised, but not displeased. I stepped inside, and the warmth of her little house wrapped around me like a blanket. She poured me tea without asking, the steam rising in curls between us. I told her in vague words about Christmas, about asking if I could come. She listened quietly, her eyes kind, and when I fell silent, she said softly, "You deserve more than that. If you ever need a place, Emily, you will always have one here." Tears burned the backs of my eyes. I reached for her hand and squeezed it, unable to speak for a moment. She smiled faintly and changed the subject to her students again, letting me gather myself. Sitting there, I felt a calm settle deep in me. The mirror had tilted the truth plain now. My family could keep their trips and their laughter that cut like knives. I had seen who stood when it mattered, and I would remember. When I left her house that evening, the night air was crisp, sharp enough to sting. I pulled my coat tighter around me, walked slowly to the car, and paused with my hand on the door. Above me, the sky stretched wide, sprinkled with stars, cold and brilliant. I looked up and whispered to myself that their refusal had only sharpened the line I would draw. The silence that had once made me feel small now felt like armor. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine humming steady beneath me, carrying me forward into the choice I had already made. The week after that night with Aunt Linda, my phone buzzed while I was sorting files at my desk. Charlotte's name lit up the screen. I answered, and her voice came fast, the kind of tone that carried bad news before the words even landed. "Emily, have you heard about your father?" I froze, pen in hand, staring at the half-written note in front of me. She went on. "Richard put a big chunk of money into some tech startup. It tanked. He lost nearly everything he had in his brokerage account." I sank back in my chair, the air thinning around me. My father, who had always bragged about his market sense, who mocked me for not knowing how to handle money, now watching his empire crumble. I pressed my fingers to my temple as Charlotte continued. "And Daniel, did you know he has a malpractice lawsuit a patient filed last month? If it sticks, it could ruin him." She sighed. "Your mom sounded frantic when she called the clinic asking for advice." I set the pen down slowly and leaned forward, elbows on my desk. The office around me buzzed with the dull rhythm of copy machines and phones ringing, yet it all sounded far away. I asked Charlotte what else she knew. She said Hannah was worried because Paul had taken on more credit than she realized. That new car Ryan drives, all on Paul's card. debt stacked up like dominoes ready to fall. The picture was so sharp I almost laughed. The family that had banished me to the corner of the table, who sneered when I asked to come to Christmas, now tangled in the very net they wove with pride. When the call ended, I sat still for a long while. My heart should have softened maybe, but instead, it hardened in slow, deliberate beats. I opened my drawer and pulled out the envelope I had tucked beneath a stack of folders. Inside was the certificate, crisp and unassuming, that confirmed what the lottery office had already wired to my account. $2 million mine in trust, shielded from greedy eyes. I held it between my fingers, staring at the print until it blurred. My pulse quickened. The stage was being set without me lifting a hand. Their fortress was crumbling, and I alone held the key to something greater. Later that evening, I drove past my parents' house. The lights were on, shadows moving across the curtains. I parked across the street unseen and watched for a moment. Through the glass, I saw my father pacing the living room, phone pressed tight to his ear. My mother sat stiff on the sofa, arms folded, her gaze sharp on nothing. Even from the car, I could read the tension in her posture. The house that once glowed with smug certainty now flickered with worry. I stayed only a few minutes, the cold seeping through the windshield, then drove on. At home, I laid the certificate on the table and stared at it under the lamp. My fingers brushed the edges, and the thought burned clear in my mind. They had laughed while I sat alone with a plastic plate. They had told me I was nothing, a burden, an embarrassment. And now, while their walls collapsed, I held a weapon they could not see. I whispered into the quiet room that their judgment would not last forever. Charlotte called again a few days later with updates. The malpractice case was heating up. The plaintiff's attorney was aggressive, painting Daniel as careless. My father's losses were worse than first thought. He had leveraged accounts to buy in big. Margin calls were wiping him out. Hannah and Paul were arguing about bills, about Ryan's reckless spending. Each detail stacked neatly, a tower shaking under its own weight. I listened, nodding, though she could not see me, murmuring only enough to keep her talking. After we hung up, I walked to the mirror in my bedroom. The woman looking back no longer flinched. I thought of Linda, of her quiet offer to help me if I ever needed it. Her small paycheck stretched thin. She had nothing, yet she offered anyway. My family had everything, yet when I had asked for Christmas, they gave me nothing. The truth settled heavy and unshakable. I would not waste what I held. I would not throw it like a rope to people who had watched me drown. I folded the certificate back into its envelope, slid it into the drawer, and locked it. My hand lingered on the key. The time was not yet right. But soon, very soon, the curtain would lift, and they would see me not as the forgotten daughter, but as the one who had survived, the one who had endured, the one who now carried the power they could never take away. I turned off the lamp and stood in the quiet dark, the hum of the city faint through the window. My breath came steady. The night held no weight I could not bear. The stage was building piece by piece, and I was ready to step into the light when the moment came. Thanksgiving morning broke with a sharp chill, the kind that cut through even the thickest sweater. I drove to my parents' house with my heart steady, a folder of documents resting in the passenger seat. The sky hung low and gray, the bare trees like silhouettes against the clouds. I parked at the curb, smoothed the front of my navy dress, and stepped onto the walkway I had once dreaded. Today, it felt like a stage waiting for me. Inside, the house was alive with noise and smells of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and butter. Hannah's laugh carried from the kitchen, high and polished. Daniel's deep voice boomed as he told a story I could not quite catch. Ryan ran past me without a glance, his phone lit up in his hand. My mother, Margaret, saw me enter and gave me the same quick, forced smile she always did, the one that never reached her eyes. She gestured toward the small card table in the corner, already set with mismatched chairs and a plastic plate. My father, Richard, barely looked up, only muttered something about keeping the noise down. The humiliation was familiar, but the sting was gone. I took my seat quietly, hands folded in my lap, my folder resting against the chair leg. From my spot, I watched them gather at the grand dining table. Crystal glasses filled the centerpiece, glowing with candles. Daniel carved jokes along with the turkey. Hannah clinked her glass against Paul's. My parents basked in the illusion of control. When Richard raised his glass to call for silence, everyone turned expecting the usual toast. My heart beat steady, not fast, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. I stood. The scrape of my chair on the floor cut through the chatter. All eyes turned. My folder felt solid in my hand as I walked closer to their table. Margaret frowned, her lips pressing thin. Hannah tilted her head, curious but smug. Richard narrowed his eyes as though daring me to interrupt. I cleared my throat, my voice stronger than I remembered it ever being. I said I had an announcement, something worth their attention. The room stilled. I opened the folder and pulled out the signed documents, my fingers steady. I told them I had recently created the Dawson Morgan Trust, funded with $2 million from my lottery winnings. I paused, letting the words settle. For a moment, no one moved. Then Hannah's glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the hardwood. Daniel's fork clattered onto his plate, his mouth hanging open. Margaret gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles whitened. Richard simply stared, his eyes darting between the papers, and my face disbelief etched deep. I said calmly that the trust would be managed jointly by me and Aunt Linda, the only person who had ever stood by me without expectation. The silence pressed in, broken by Daniel's sudden roar. He shot up from his chair, his face flushed, veins standing out at his neck. He demanded to know why he was excluded, why the money wasn't divided equally, why I thought I had the right to decide without the family. His voice shook the walls, spit flying as he ranted. Hannah tried to hush him, but her own face was pale, her eyes fixed on the documents as though they might vanish. Margaret started to speak, but her words tangled, broken by her own shock. I stood unmoved, my eyes on them all. Then the front door opened and footsteps echoed down the hall. Greg Thompson stepped into the dining room, his suit pressed, a calm authority radiating from him. I had asked him to join, though I had not told the family. He greeted them politely, then laid down a briefcase on the table. He introduced himself as my attorney and explained that the trust was fully legal, filed with the state, and untouchable by anyone outside of its management. His tone was clear, his language final. No relative, no parent, no sibling could override it. Daniel sputtered, pointing at me with a shaking finger, saying I was manipulating, I was tricking them. Greg met his eyes and repeated that the documents were binding. He slid copies across the table for them to see. The sound of the paper against the wood was louder than Daniel's fury. Margaret sank back into her chair, her face pale, her hand trembling at her throat. Richard said nothing, only stared at me, a storm of pride and humiliation crossing his features. Hannah looked as though she might faint. I did not raise my voice. I simply told them this was the future, and that they could not erase me anymore. For years I had accepted the corner, the plastic plates, the laughter at my expense. That era ended today. My voice did not shake. My eyes did not drop. I told them Aunt Linda would finally have security, that the money would be used with integrity, and that I no longer owed them silence. Daniel's rage faltered. His hands clenched at his sides, but he did not move forward. Margaret tried to smile, a desperate flicker that fell flat. Richard's jaw worked as if he might speak. Then he stayed silent. Hannah bent to pick shards of glass from the floor, her movements stiff, mechanical. The room was heavy with the weight of something irreversible. I felt my shoulders straighten. The fear that had lived inside me for years had no place here anymore. I held their gaze one by one and did not look away. The silence in the dining room stretched until the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway filled the air. I placed the folder back into my bag and straightened, waiting to see who would speak first. It was Margaret, her voice thin and brittle, saying perhaps she had been too harsh, that families should stick together. Richard nodded stiffly, muttering that we could move forward if I just remembered where I came from. Their words rang hollow, practiced like an old play they had performed too many times before. Daniel's face stayed red, his jaw tight, but his eyes darted to Greg, then back to me, as if searching for any weakness. Hannah reached for a napkin, blotting at her dress, though no wine had spilled. I felt the air shift in the room, not from love or acceptance, but from fear of losing the control they had clung to for years. Later that evening, as coats were gathered and plates stacked, Ryan lingered by the doorway. He was only 22, full of the arrogance of youth, but his hands trembled as he shoved them into his pockets. He asked if I could lend him something just enough to cover what he called a small mistake. His voice cracked when I pressed him and the truth spilled. Gambling debts, credit cards maxed out, collectors calling. I looked at him, my nephew, and for a moment, the ache of old habits tugged at me, the urge to save, to sacrifice. But the image of Aunt Linda's quiet face, her gentle offer of help, when she had so little, steadied me. I told Ryan no. I told him he had choices, and that he would have to live with them. His eyes filled with resentment, not gratitude, as he turned away. The days after Thanksgiving passed quietly. My phone buzzed with messages from Margaret, polite words coated in syrup, invitations to dinner to talk. I let them go unanswered. Instead, I drove across town to Aunt Linda's modest home. She and Uncle Frank were sitting at the kitchen table when I placed a set of keys in front of them. Confused, she picked them up and asked what they were for. I told her the mortgage had been paid in full, and that a small 2-story house near Laurelhurst Park now belonged to them. Tears welled in her eyes, and Frank covered his mouth with his hand. They protested, but I reminded them of every kindness they had shown me, of the nights they invited me for dinner, when my own parents pretended to forget me. It was not charity. It was justice. With Greg's guidance, I moved quietly, investing the rest of the trust with care. Part of it went into a scholarship fund for children in Portland who, like me, had been told they were less than enough. I visited one of the schools in the district, watched the students bent over their books, and felt a kind of peace I had never known. For once, my money was not a weight of guilt or suspicion. It was a key that unlocked doors for others. Meanwhile, news of Richard's failed investments reached me through Charlotte. He had poured too much into a real estate project that collapsed, leaving him scrambling. Daniel's lawsuit gained traction, patients demanding compensation for mistakes he had tried to bury. Hannah's social media posts grew thinner, the lavish backdrops replaced with quiet corners of her house. Their world was tilting, but I no longer stood beneath it. I had built my own ground, solid and steady. One evening I walked along the Willamette River, the city lights reflected in the dark water, fireworks from a winter event popping in the distance. I thought of the night on the porch when I had been left with plastic plates and cold stares. The path from that night to this one had been steep and lonely, but every step had led me here. I did not feel triumph so much as release, as if the chains that had bound me to their approval had finally rusted away. I still saw them sometimes at weddings or funerals, and their smiles always carried the edge of hunger. But I no longer sat at the small table. I no longer waited for scraps of love. I had my own place now, built by my own hands, strengthened by those who truly cared. As winter gave way to spring, I signed the final paperwork for the Scholarship Foundation and watched the first letters go out to students who would receive help. My name was not on the documents for the public to see. Instead, they read simply, Dawson Morgan Trust, a quiet legacy that would outlast the noise of family grudges. That night, I walked through Laurelhurst Park, where children played on the swings under budding trees. My chest filled with something lighter than pride, heavier than relief. It was the weight of freedom. This story reminds me that sometimes justice arrives in forms we never expect. Have you ever been dismissed or belittled by your own family, only to find a way to reclaim your worth? Tell me if you have ever stood in that moment of truth when everything finally turned in your favor.